You decide to take up quilting, but it seems that all of us quilters speak a different language. What do all these terms mean? What is quilting anyway? What's this thing called piecing? What's subcutting? What's applique? Ah, don't you worry, I've got you covered in this video. I'm going to cover off the 10 very basic terms that you need as a beginner in quilting. I have got you back and I've explained all of them, and there'll be a whole list of videos just down below that you can go and check out as well. Who am I? I am Kim. This is Quilt with Kim. You, my lovely, are very, very welcome. Let's get on with the very first one. We're kicking off then with piecing, because that's the very first thing that we need to do in patchwork. And that is when we have cut our fabric up. More on that coming up. But we cut our fabric up into smaller pieces and then we stitch them together. And the art or the act of doing that, of joining those pieces together to make your little blocks, which will sew into bigger blocks to make your patterns, that bit is called piecing. So that's your patchwork. It is piecing. It is cutting your bits and putting them together again. Now, there are different ways of doing it. We can, of course, do chain piecing. I've got a video on that, so I shall pop that in the description below, because if you've got lots of little pieces that you have to stitch together, and quite frankly, an awful lot of patterns will say, oh, cut 50 of those and 25 of those and join all of those together, and you're going, oh my goodness, that's far too much. You can use chain piecing, and it is should I start that sentence again? And it is a far speedier way of stitching all your pieces together, because you can put your pieces right size together and you could feed loads of them through like a chain under your machine. But as I said, check out the video below, because I'll link that up there and you can go and check out how to do that. But that is piecing, and it's a term that you will come across an awful lot in patterns, and when you go to classes the instruction will be piece these together or stitch these together, but the stitching together is your piecing. So what's number 2 on my list then? Well, number 2 is your seam allowance. What's that? Well, in patchwork, we tend to work with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, unless you're told otherwise. On the whole, expect a 1/4 of an inch. So if I turn this over, you will see here that I've got my seam there, and the seam allowance between the stitch line here, which is my yellow cotton, which hopefully is not too difficult to see, and the edge, the raw edge there at the edge, that is my seam allowance, that little gap there. And in patchwork we need to be really accurate, because our seam allowances in patchwork, as I said, are a 1/4 of an inch, and all your patterns will have been worked out to have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So when we stitch, we need to make really sure that our stitch line is a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of our fabric, or the raw edge of our fabric. And if you're wondering how on earth you're ever going to stitch one, a straight line, and B, an accurate 1/4 of an inch, I've got a video on that too. So if you check on down below, you will find out all the videos that I have mentioned in this, and that will go into it in far more detail about how to keep a straight line, how to keep an accurate 1/4 inch, in fact any seam allowance at all. And this seam allowance term switches over into pretty much anything you're sewing. So always check your pattern for the correct seam allowance. Just because in patchwork we use a 1/4 of an inch doesn't mean to say that you'll use that somewhere else. In fact, in dressmaking, you're more likely to have 1.5 centimeters. Yes, I know I'm flicking into metric. That's because dressmakers use metric, and us quilters still use imperial. But hey, that makes us very clever. It's very good for our brain to work between the two. So we'll skip over that. Do not get into arguments in the comments below, please. I can't cope with that one. Just know that you're very clever if you can work the both. Okay, so the rule is always check your pattern for the correct seam allowance for whatever it is you're stitching. But with quilting, you can pretty much guarantee it is going to be a 1/4 of an inch. Okay, let's get on to number 3 on my list. And next on my list is fat quarters, or FQ, you will see it referred to. So on patterns, it may ask you to buy a certain amount of fat quarters or a fat quarter bundle, more on that in a second, and it will refer to FQ. FQ just means fat quarter. But what is it? Well, this is what happens when you buy them, or what it looks like when you buy them. This is a whole selection of individual fat quarters that I have bought from a wholesaler to then retail through my shop. So when you go into a shop, you would buy a fat quarter, and it could have come from the wholesaler. So you can see here it's already cut up. It's cut up by a machine and it's got a label on it, as opposed to this one here, which I've cut off the bolt because somebody wanted the other one. More on that in just a second. So fat quarters, what are they? They are squares of fabric which are 18 by 22 inches. Let me swap camera and show you. Okay, don't you love a bit of tech wizardry? So this is the one that I've cut off the bolt, and you can see here that that is a square of fabric. I should do my Chad impression doing that. Do you remember Chad? I don't know what Chad was, but it was like that. I don't think I'd make a good Chad. Anyway, it is a square of fabric. Now, it is in area terms, it is a quarter of a metre. Hence, fat quarter, the quarter is a metre, and the fat refers to the fact that it is a square. If you bought a long quarter, that would be 25 centimetres cut off of the bolt, so you'd get the whole width of the fabric. But here we're talking about the fat quarter. So when you are going to buy a quarter of a metre of a fabric in a quilt shop, you need to ask them if you want a fat quarter or whether you want a long quarter. And there's a reason that you might want to differentiate between them. But let's get back to fat quarters for a moment. So fat quarters we can buy individually like this, or you can buy fat quarter bundles. So you'll probably find that you'll find 4, 5, 6 together in a bundle for you, bearing in mind that 4 of these would be a metre of fabric, if you think about it, because each is a quarter of a metre of fabric. So 4 would be a metre of fabric. So you're likely to be paying the equivalent of your metre of fabric, and of course 6 would be a metre and a half of fabric. Okay, so you can buy your fat quarters in singles or in bundles. But why would you use this? Now, I have got a whole video on fat quarters, which again I will link down below, so you can go and check that out to get the more detail out of it. But I think my advice would be that buy fat quarters if you're doing small projects. So say you're doing Christmas advent calendars, and these are actually Christmas fabrics, although you can have dots and stripes at any time, can't you? But like the advent calendars where you're making the pockets, or you're making small items, or applique, more on that in a moment, or other small projects, and that's where the fat quarters will come into their own. There are fat quarter quilts, and it will tell you whether you need to buy the fat quarters. But if you walk into a quilt shop and you fall in love with a fabric, and actually who doesn't ever do that, then I would suggest that you buy yardage. What's yardage? Yardage is when you buy your fabric off the bolt. So you would ask for a quarter of a metre, that would be your long quarter, or a half a metre, or a metre, or a metre and a half. My suggestion is that if you have fallen in love with fabric, and if it's a collection piece, so if it's a nice design, ask the quilt shop owner, because they'll tell you generally the nice designs of fabric, the collection pieces, once they're gone, and you won't tend to find them back again. And because of that, I would buy a metre and a half of that fabric, because A, you won't see it again, and B, it gives you the width and the length of your fabric to do something decent with. There is nothing more frustrating than be able to look at a pattern, fall in love with a pattern, and then discover that you need far more fabric than you're ever going to get in a fat quarter. So it's really something to have a think about. There's room for both, but yeah, my advice would always be, if you fall in love with the fabric and it's likely to be when it's gone, then buy a yardage and buy a metre and a half. Then you've got something decent to do something with. Okay, so after fat quarters, we've got some subcutting. What's that? We spoke about piecing earlier, but what about subcutting? Now, I've covered this in depth in another video where I teach you exactly how to do that. But essentially, there's two types of subcutting. There's the subcutting where we have our initial strip of fabric that we've taken off our width of fabric, and we're going to cut that down into smaller pieces, whether it be rectangles or squares. We're always going to start by cutting the scraggly end off at the selvage, and then we'd turn it around, and then we'd cut this into smaller squares. So let me just do one just to give you an example. There we go. So that would be subcutting, and your pattern would say subcut your strip into, I don't know, 10 rectangles of a certain size. Your pattern will do that. So that's subcutting off a width of fabric. But then you also can subcut when you have got pieces already stitched together, and this is quite common depending on your pattern. This is strip piecing, so these are strips that I've taken off a jelly roll. Don't worry, I shall cover that in another video. Jelly roll strips are just 2.5 inches wide, that's all they are, but we have stitched these together, and then subcutting would say join all of that together, and then again we would cut it down. Is my ruler long enough? We would cut it down into smaller pieces. So to give you an example of that, we would give ourselves a straight edge there. So I'd get rid of that scraggly end, and then we would turn it around, and then we would cut our strips at whatever the pattern says. So again, we've stitched our lengths of fabric together, our strips together, and we subcut down to whatever the pattern says. So let's make this 2.5 inches. If my ruler will fit, there we go, I'm just off the edge. So we would subcut that down to however many subcuts your pattern says. And then when we've got a whole bundle of them, like I have done earlier off another selection of this, you can see that as we start layering them together, we can make our pretty patterns however we want to do it. There we go. That will work like that. So we would join all those together to make that checkerboard effect. So if you're wondering whether all this checkerboard effect was cutting out lots of little squares, no, don't worry, it's a lot quicker, and that's where subcutting comes into its own. It's a lot quicker to stitch long lengths together and then subcut them down, particularly when you're making the smaller blocks to sew it together into bigger blocks. So that's subcutting. And then we have applique. Now, applique just means in French to apply. Go me with the French. And that basically means that on the whole, we are putting one fabric on top of another one and then stitching them down. This is not always the case. There are about 11 or 12 different types of applique. I'm not going to cover them all in this particular video, but watch out soon. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell because I've got something special coming up in a little while, in a couple of months or so. So keep with me. But back to applique. So this one here with my cute little ghost that you would have seen in a previous video. This is a fusible web applique. So I use Bonder Web, which is the brand name. That's basically a fusible adhesive. It's on a really thin web-like fabric or material, and it sits in between my applique ghost here, or the ghost, and the background fabric, and we use an iron to heat it, and in heating it the fabric sticks down, and then we will stitch around the edge of that. Again, it's a personal choice because you don't have to, but let's not go into that now. So we've got our fusible web applique. That's probably the simplest that most of us start off with, depending, but if you're a traditionalist, you may want to do it by hand. And that's where we've got needle turn applique coming into its own, where we've got fabric shapes cut out, and we're stitching those down by hand, and we're tucking in the edges as we go. So that's another form of applique. So I said I'm not going into all of them. I'm just giving you a bit of an introduction. We do, of course, have things like Celtic applique. Now, if you've watched me for a while, you will have seen this in lots of other videos. I love Celtic applique. Some of my students don't like it so much, and I can understand why. And Celtic applique forms Celtic knots, so it goes over and under, and it looks like a continuous loop. Big secret, it's not. Maybe I'll cover that in another video. But Celtic applique is using bias strips to do this. So we got Celtic applique, we got stained glass applique, but still we're applying our fabric of the applique down onto the backing fabric. However, there is another kind called reverse applique. Let me just switch camera. I tell you, the magic of the buttons on my recording software. So this is reverse applique, and reverse applique is, as the name suggests, the other way around. So those strips, the black through to the fawny colours were stitched first, and then the yellow of the sun there actually modelled on a cockerel feather. Wouldn't you know, I had great fun doing that. So the yellow sits behind the other strips, and then we stitch it and we cut through. Again, don't worry about it if you're just starting out. Just know that that is a technique that exists, if I can get my words out, and it's really good for building up different colour layers or making things look really interesting from behind your main fabric. So we're still kind of got one fabric on top of the other, but it's just the other way around. So that's applique, where we've got one fabric on top of another one. There's lots of varieties of those. As I said, watch out soon. Make sure you subscribe, because otherwise you're going to miss out on something very exciting. Right, what is next on my list? Well, that is layering your quilt. What on earth does that mean? Well, that means we put the three parts of our quilt together to make our quilt sandwich. More of that in just a second. So these are our little pieces that we put together in the piecing section of this video. I'm going to pretend this is my quilt top. So your quilt top is the top layer of your quilt, and it is generally the pretty bit that you've made with your patchwork. We have our backing fabric. Don't judge the colour combos on this. This is just from my scraps to make samples. Although they don't not go together, I think that's probably all right. But your backing fabric tends to be a bigger piece of fabric. It tends to be all the same, but it doesn't have to be. So if you want to piece the back, you know what piecing means now, but if you want to piece your backing fabric, you can absolutely do that too. Now, you'll find for backing fabric, you can find extra wide widths of 108 inches wide that you'll find will mean that you can put the backing on your fabric without having to cut your meters of fabric up and re-sew it together again in a different way to get the whole backing on. But for larger quilts, you're unlikely to get a full coverage without any stitch lines out of a standard yardage of fabric, which is where those extra wide widths come in. But how do we layer a quilt? Well, I've got a video on that, as you might expect. All the links are down below. You're going to get very bored of me saying that, but by the end of this video. So we take our backing fabric, we put that with the back, the right side facing down, so the wrong side is facing up to us. And then we have our batting or our wadding. It is exactly the same thing. That provides the cushioning in the middle of our quilt, and you would place that on the wrong side of your backing fabric, and then we would put our quilt top that we finished in the middle. And that is correct, that we'd have what's called overage all the way round there. That is because when we do the quilting, I'll come on to that in a bit, don't you worry, when we do the quilting it tends to bring those edges in. So when we layer those three together, that is called a quilt sandwich. Okay, we've got our quilt top, we've got our wadding or our batting, and then we've got our backing. But before we quilt those, we need to baste them. So what does that mean? So basting means that we are holding these three layers of our quilt sandwich together, because if we layered it up like this and then we started the quilting, don't worry, more of that in a minute. I know I just said that, but just a reminder, when we have led that up, it will not stay together under your machine. So, okay, a small little tiny piece like this probably will stay together. Even then, I would baste it to hold the 3 layers together so it does not wriggle around and get all out of sync. Because when you're putting it under your machine, even with your walking foot, you'll find that things move where you don't want them, and we don't want that. So there are different types of basting. You can baste with a 505 spray or a temporary fabric adhesive spray. 505 is a really common brand. You'll see people referring to 505. That's what it is. It's a temporary adhesive that we spray this on. I have covered this in a video on layering your quilt, so check that one out in the description below. But we can do that by a spray adhesive, or we can use common or garden good old-fashioned pins. Nothing wrong with that at all. So we've got quilt pins there that we can use that to hold our layers together. We also get these rather natty little safety pins which have a curve in them. Can you see that? Let's try and get the camera to focus a bit. So they have a curve in them. That doesn't mean to say they've gone wrong. That is supposed to give you a bit easier way, if I can get my words out, it's an easier way of being able to baste your fabric by pinning those together. It's a little bit easier. If you've just got normal safety pins, that's fine too. So that's those. You can obviously use standard needle and thread. I would use a thick thread. This isn't particularly, I've just got this to show you needle and thread, but get a needle and a thread. But what you want is a thread that is really going to show up against your quilt top, because whatever you baste with, you would take it away afterwards. So you would take out your pins, you would take out your safety pins, your temporary adhesive, your 505 spray, that will wash out easily, so don't worry about that. You can also, by the way, talking about getting things out, just reminds me, you can get these little stitch guns. So you know how the tags are attached on your clothes when you buy them, and there's a little plasticky bit that holds the label on. Well, you can get these for quilting. If I'm being completely honest, I bought one ages ago. I used it on one quilt and swore blind I would never use it again, and I would just tell people about it, because you can't find the bits of plastic. They're really small. Maybe it was the quilt I chose. It had a plush back. It's a really cozy quilt. I love it. However, finding all the little plastic bits is a nightmare. And I think as well, those plastic bits get lost, and it's probably not great for the environment. So, but you can get those. If you love them, go for them. Just personally, I didn't get on with them. So that is basting. Your basting is holding these 3 layers together whilst you are doing your quilting. And that brings me very nicely onto the quilting. So quilting is when we stitch these 3 layers together, because we've pinned them in place, we've basted them, pins, sprayed, however you want to join them. We've created our quilt sandwich. Now we do the quilting bit. So the quilting is decorative. It holds these 3 layers together, and it creates all those little pockets of air, which makes our quilt all cushiony and snuggly and lovely and warm and comfortable. Let me show you. This is a bag. This has appeared in another video recently, but you can see here how I've been quilting this in just a very simple crosshatch design. In fact, this is a bag I'm making, and this is my ode to Gucci, is this little bit, but I did it. Who needs Gucci anyway? So you can see here, even on this bag, we've got the 3 layers of our quilt. We've got this really lovely denim-y colour with all these metallic multicoloured dots. We've got a wadding in the middle there, this wadding or batting. In fact, this is a structural one to give my bag some structure. And then we've got a backing layer, which is the purple in this particular case. And I have quilted through those 3 layers. So that is the quilting, where we stitch through all those 3 layers. But when we do that, this is why we need this overage, as I said, because it will pull these edges in, particularly on a larger quilt. You won't see it too much effect on the smaller things like this, like a little coaster or something. But when you get to a big quilt, you definitely need a big overage to pull those edges in. Let me show you on here as well. I'm obviously all about the cross hatching. In fact, these were to show 2 different ways of doing courthouse steps. Can you see how different they are? I do these as a course, by the way, so if you want to check that out, I'll pop that in the description below. There's going to be loads of links down below, aren't there, for you to go and check out. But you can see here where I've done my piecing. So this is the courthouse steps in this particular example, and then I have quilted a nice big, I think these are about 1.5 inches, these, and can you see how puffy that has made it? I think even on the camera you can see that as I've quilted it, it's puffed it up, it's trapped air and made these really squishy squashy. Now these are pot holders. There is a thermal wadding inside, so I'm not going to use them to snuggle up on the sofa with, but I am going to put pots on them, or in these cases, these are my teaching samples, but they've still got thermal wadding inside, so they will work as a pot holder or to hold things or whatever. But you can see how this quilting has made that puffy effect, and that's what we want for our quilting. So the quilting is the act of sewing those 3 layers together. We can do it by machine in straight lines. We can do free motion quilting on our machine, which is where you get all the pretty patterns that you can do. You can do a lot with your straight lines, but with your free motion quilting you can do anything you like on your machine. You are completely in control. You can also obviously do hand quilting, and I've got a little series on hand quilting and hand tying that you might want to go and check out. So that is quilting. But the last thing on our terms list is binding. Now, binding comes in 2 types. There is bias binding and there is straight grain binding. Which do you need? It depends on whether you're doing square things or whether you're doing circular things. If you are binding around corners and circles, you need your bias binding, and that is when your binding is cut on the bias, which is the stretchy bit of your fabric. If you don't know how to do that, don't you worry, I've got a video that covers that, again in the description below. So that is your bias binding. That means it'll ease round these corners and you'll get no wrinkles at all. If I tried to do that with a straight grain binding, that would not work. You would not get that nice finish, and I think I've demonstrated that in my video. So that's when you use bias binding. But for everything else you can use straight grain binding when you're just doing squares and rectangles, because that's all we need to do is go around the edge. Now what our binding does is it covers those edges. So with my bag here, I've done my quilting, we've got our raw edges left, but my binding, if I get a piece of fabric and just pretend, I actually can't find any fabric at all now. Let's just grab this bit. We can see here, if I pretended to make a binding, here we go, live on camera, one little bit of binding. That's how you make binding. It's really very easy. Okay, if I put that binding over there, you can see that how that would then cover the edges of that. So that's why we are using our binding, is to seal the edge. And you would put that binding all the way round. Now this particular example here, I've used mitered corners. I've got a video which is really popular, just focusing on how to make that mitre corner absolutely perfectly every single time. So if you don't know what the mitre is, that's when you get a little fold at a 45-degree angle as we turn our binding around the corners to make it all nice and neat and square. If those scare you silly, then you can absolutely use a folded over binding like that. And there are also other ways of binding without even having to turn those corners over. So I've got a whole playlist on binding, so go and check that out. You'll find how to put binding on, you'll find out how to make the mitre corners there, and you'll also find how to make your bias binding as well. And by the way, if you fancy making these, if you've been eyeing these up, these are quilted style table mats which come in my course about learning to quilt. So they're designed for beginners at quilting. So if you've done a bit of patchwork but now you want to get into the quilting, these are the mats for you to go and learn on. But if you're a complete beginner, check out my introduction to patchwork course, because that'll get you going right from the get-go. But I'll link all that in the description below. But that is your binding. Now your binding just a last word, does not have to be the same colour as what's going on in the middle of your quilt. You can use different types of binding around the edge to get really interesting effects. So you can have something very contrast, you can have something that blends and almost disappears. You could have a scrappy binding, so if you've got lots of scraps of all the fabric that you've been using in your quilt, you can stitch all those together and make a big long strip, and that looks really effective. So don't be thinking that you just have to use one fabric with your binding. You do not. I'll cover a scrappy binding in another video because I think it's a really lovely thing to do. So there are far more terms that you need to know, and I will cover those in a future video because otherwise this will be 3 days long. And I'm sure you've got things to go and do. However, this is the 10 terms that will get you going, and I think I threw in some bonus ones in there as well. But those are your 10 basic quilting terms that will help you as a beginner in quilting. If it has, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and do hit that notification bell because you won't miss out on the future videos that I will put up, including that very interesting, exciting, I'm not going to tell you anything more. You just have to press the notification bell and see in a few weeks' time. You're going to love it, I promise. I hope that has helped today. I love you and leave you for now, and I shall see you next time. Bye for now.